You're on The Morning Show with Rikki Lambert. I've come across a fascinating article in The Economist magazine, and it opens by saying, for a man who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, David Cameron has a remarkable ability to attract bad luck. His decision to bet the country's future on the result of a referendum on the European Union was one of the most disastrous gambles in British history, up there with Lord North's decision to impose taxes on tea in the American colonies. Now his post-political career is collapsing in ruins. The article goes on to talk about how Mr Cameron ended up landing a job with a Mr Greensill at Greensill Capital, and this will be of particular interest to our South Australian listeners because that is a name that is becoming synonymous with the Whyalla Steelworks. To paraphrase what the article says, there was a belief within Greensill that Mr Cameron might have access to people within government to help prop up Greensill Capital. As the article reads, the trouble with this marriage made in heaven is that Greensill Capital has now collapsed, and many companies that are depending on it, including Liberty Steel, which employs almost 5,000 people, are teetering on the edge. The article goes on to conclude that there is a greater number of ex-prime ministers in Britain than there has been in history, because some of them used to die not long after they left office, like Disraeli or Churchill, or they were self-made men who were able to look after themselves financially, whereas Mr Cameron was a much younger person when he went into office. And as the article says, Britain needs to keep these proliferating former prime ministers on a tighter leash. It's making the argument about restricting their lobbying and business activities. But it does say at the end that the serving Prime Minister needs to put rivalries aside and put these former rivals into jobs where they can make a major public contribution because, as it says, people who make it to number 10 Downing Street invariably have an unusual amount of energy. They should be given more opportunity to serve the nation and less to serve themselves. And two people I think who are former Prime Ministers who are suffering from relevance deprivation syndrome, as I call it, are Malcolm Turnbull and Kevin Rudd. I'll get to Mr Rudd in a minute, but it's certainly topical to talk about Malcolm Turnbull because he was given a role on a peak climate body in New South Wales by a very green-leaning Liberal Environment Minister, and that drew immediate howls of derision, particularly with the New South Wales government looking at a loss in a by-election where a Nationals MP has stood down, and it's in a coal-reliant seat in the Upper Hunter. Now, Mr Turnbull himself didn't achieve much in office, aside from... so he redefined marriage, and he also imposed a bonking ban. That's all I can think of off the top of my head. But you have to look at his contribution alongside that of Kevin Rudd, the former Labor Prime Minister who's been running around with this conspiracy theory about the Murdoch press. He claimed in a recent Senate hearing that he was terrified of offending the Murdoch press when he was Prime Minister, and he claimed that Mr Turnbull had told him something similar. Mr Rudd is a man who has a very high belief in his own importance, and I felt that when he was Prime Minister he was angling for a higher role, and sure enough he was wanting to get into the position of UN Secretary-General in more recent years. Now, he may well have a great deal to offer the country, but I don't feel that running around with a conspiracy theory about the Murdoch press is doing the country any favours. I'm no fan of the Murdoch press myself. I don't read their newspapers, but I think they're a greater threat to our country than a newspaper organisation. You have to look at those contributions from Mr Turnbull and Mr Rudd and compare them, say, with that of Mr Abbott, who generally shies away from publicity and gets on with doing volunteer work. And I have to say former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, by and large, keeps pretty quiet. And when she does comment on public matters, it's using her weight as a former Prime Minister to support a worthy cause like mental health. We have former Prime Minister Paul Keating, who's still banging on about superannuation that was one of his babies as Treasurer. That's understandable. He's got a skin in that game. He wants to see that policy come to fruition. But the one I think keeps the most dignified position when it comes to commenting on public matters is former Prime Minister John Howard, who rarely will venture into public policy matters and say, well, that's a matter for those who are now governing the country. We simply have too many former Prime Ministers due to the major parties delivering us the constant knifing and rolling of Prime Ministers over the last couple of decades. Hopefully, with some stability in future years, we won't have so many Prime Ministers offering their two bobs worth and feeling like they've got so much to offer the public with their opinions because they've had a decent crack at their time in office.